Hi, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us today for the last of our four-part York Circle at Home lecture series for this academic year. My name is Julie Lafford. I'm the Executive Director for Alumni Engagement at York University. I want to start this morning by acknowledging the land we live and work on. As this event is virtual and we're not all gathered in the same space, I recognize that the following land acknowledgement might not be for the territory that you're currently on. And if that's the case, please take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory you're on and the current treaty holders. As a member of the York University community, I recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located, and these precede the establishment of the university. York acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It's now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. I am truly grateful for the opportunity to live and work on Treaty 13 land. I also want to acknowledge that the funeral for Prince Philip is taking place this morning, so we might have a slightly smaller audience than anticipated. And I want to thank you to those of you who've joined us this morning live. I also want to send a special thanks to those in our audience who registered for and attended 3 or more sessions of York Circle. You'll receive a York U mug as our thanks. And at the end of this session, everyone will have a chance to win one of 4 $25 gift cards, courtesy of our affinity partner, MBNA. We'll draw the names of the gift card winners at the end of today's session. So today, Dr. Pillai Riddell, Associate Vice President for Research and Academic Chair of York Circle, will host presentations from 5 of the university's experts, followed by a panel discussion and Q&A where speakers will answer the questions from the audience. If you'd like to submit a question, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Dr. Pillai Riddell will pose as many of your questions to the panelists as possible. As always, the presentation will also be recorded and uploaded to our YouTube page for you to share with friends and family. Please note that all your questions and comments are visible to our panelists and the staff working behind the scenes. We ask that you keep your comments relevant to the topic at hand and respectful. Today's lecture is the impact of the pandemic on the environment. And before we begin, I'd like to take a quick poll. Our question this morning is, how would you rate your knowledge of the topic of today's presentation? It should pop up on your screen right now. And I'll give everyone a moment to respond to that. While we're waiting for the results to come in, I just do want to note that the reason we ask this question is because it's helpful for our speakers to know who's in the audience and gauge your knowledge of the topic already. As always, it's great to have so many people with us today, and the results are in now. And I see that 53% feel somewhat informed about the topic, 35% minimal, and 9% are new to the topic. Only 3%, 2 of you, say your knowledge is very high. So like me, it seems like people have a lot to learn, and I'm looking forward to this lecture very much. And without further ado, I am now delighted to introduce our host for this series and today's presentation, Dr. Rebecca Pillai Riddell. Dr. Pillai Riddell is a professor in the Faculty of Health. In 2018, York's Faculty of Graduate Studies honored her with the faculty's Teaching Award for achievements in graduate teaching and supervisory excellence. Additionally, Dr. Pillai Riddell is a pediatric pain researcher and clinical psychologist at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto. An acclaimed researcher, she leads the OUCH Lab, which stands for Opportunities to Understand Childhood Hurt, and where she seeks to reduce pain in child health. Welcome, Dr. Pillai Riddell. As always, it's a pleasure to see you today, and I'll turn things over to you to introduce the panelists.
Thank you, Julie. Good morning and welcome, everybody. I hope everyone is staying safe and well during these very unprecedented times. As Julie mentioned, my name is Dr. Rebecca Pillai Riddell, and I'm the Academic Chair of the York Circle Lecture Series. The pandemic has presented everyone with unprecedented challenges for our generation. I'm sure we've all sort of had some chance today to process what was announced yesterday as ICU beds are filling up and our fatigue with the compliance of rules come down. Scholarship and compassion and understanding how we are all connected is more important now than ever. York Circle has decided to highlight the diverse strengths of York researchers, from policymakers to molecular scientists, to engage audiences in lively intersections of ideas related to the pandemic. For the first time, York Circle has brought together multidisciplinary panelists to dissect and discuss 4 themes over 4 sessions throughout the 2020-2021 academic year, all of which have occurred within the context, of the COVID-19 pandemic. Today is the 4th and final topic of the series, entitled The Impact of the Pandemic on the Environment. 1 year into the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen immeasurable changes for our lives, including the environment. In today's session, York experts will discuss changes to the environment during the pandemic and the importance of our connection to it. Our first speaker, Dr. Deborah McGregor, will present on the root causes of the pandemic and the link between unsustainable human practices and the environment, along with the Indigenous perspective. Dr. Gabrielle Slowly will discuss our connection to the land with a special focus on the Arctic. Dr. James Stinson will discuss the impact of the pandemic and lockdown procedures on parks and conservation areas. Dr. Eric Kennedy will outline how natural disasters are managed during a pandemic. And we will end with Dr. Mark Winfield, who will present the impact of the pandemic on our biophysical environment. I'm so pleased that Deborah, Gabrielle, James, Eric, and Mark could join us today. I know you will learn so much from their presentations. Now I will introduce our first speaker, Dr. Deb McGregor. Dr. McGregor joined York University's Osgoode Hall Law faculty in 2015 as a cross-appointed professor with the Faculty of Environmental Studies and Urban Change. Professor McGregor's research has focused on Indigenous knowledge systems and their various applications in diverse contexts, including water and environmental governance, environmental justice, forest policy, and management and sustainable development. Her research has been published in a variety of national and international journals, and she has delivered numerous public and academic presentations relating to Indigenous knowledge systems, government, and sustainability. Welcome, Dr. McGregor.
Thank you for that introduction. I want to welcome everyone this morning. If you're in the GTA, it's a little bit gloomy, but again, as Julie pointed out, people are everywhere. So hopefully in the 10 short minutes that I have, I'll be able to convey some of my thinking around this topic. But I think primarily, if there's a takeaway, it's like recognizing COVID-19 as being an environmental, is actually an environmental issue with primary responsibility on humans to have sustainable relationships with the environment. So just bear with me while I share screen. Zoom randomly kind of kicked me out this morning. Slideshow. So if that happens, just log back in again like I had to. So Zoom can be a little bit unpredictable. So as Rebecca pointed out, that I am going to talk a little bit about, I wanted to bring an Indigenous perspective into this conversation as much as I can, but did want to talk a little bit about sorry
to interrupt you, Deborah, but we can't see your slides.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
I got to go to Zoom. I can't believe I did that after teaching all this time. Okay. Sorry, people, for that. Oh, all right. Can people see that now?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, sorry about that. You'd think with all this virtual teaching, I would have mastered that. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, well, for me, and we did the land acknowledgement. So a big part of the perspective that I come from is that Indigenous peoples, particularly where I live and work, which is right now I'm sitting in a chair in Toronto, is Indigenous peoples have been here for thousands of years as complete societies and had everything complete societies had: laws, governance systems, knowledge systems. And a big part of our knowledge system was to enable and facilitate people to have sustainable relationships with what I say all of creation, even though that sort of, I guess, signifies particular things to people. But what I mean by that is the natural world and then beyond the natural world. Indigenous knowledges, thinking, philosophies around this always goes beyond the human dimension in relation to this. So I always like to start that way, because in these efforts to include Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous people into these conversations actually is not new to Indigenous peoples at all. It's just becomes of interest to what I call external interests. So I'm not going to read this slide, but essentially before COVID-19 happened, there had been, of course, other pandemics, but this is just the IPCC report and the IPBES report on ecosystems and climate change. We're pointing to the fact that things were already not well in terms of planetary health. So, and this is all the leading scientists from around the world. So this was not new to folks. I was particularly taken with this report, although some parts of it, again, because I have this lens that I look at it from, the United Nations program and the Livestock Research Institute's report, but I did think that they did point to some really, something that I always sort of pay attention to through the lens that I had, that part of what this report did was it outlined the root causes of the pandemic, climate change, humans basically unsustainable relationship with the natural world. And this isn't new. I mean, many reports have said this, but now is directly pointing to the cause of the pandemic, to these, I guess, economic systems or lack of environmental protection and sustainability that was happening across the planet. So the main message from this particular report, and it came out July of last year, and even before that, so this is, April 17th, Earth Day is coming up in a few days. And I remember giving a presentation to youth and they're saying, well, what is the root cause of the pandemic? And at the time, before seeing the report, I go, well, it has to do with humans, the nature of the humans' relationship with the natural world and food systems. And these are all kind of interconnected. And then the report comes out. And it essentially promotes a One Health approach between humans, the environment, and animals as being, and this is not a new approach, but it was really trying to get people to kind of think about that interchange in terms of their research and in terms of policy and laws and as an approach to a solution to future pandemics, because they're also, if we don't change the way that we're doing things, then there's going to be future pandemics. So because I come from, again, I'm speak from an Indigenous perspective, not the Indigenous perspective, but one of the things that I do in my work is I pay attention to what a lot of the international Indigenous community is saying when they go to different environmental conferences, sustainable development conferences. And this is the Mandeliong Declaration. And there's a number of them that Indigenous peoples have had since the Earth Summit in 92, and they've been pointing out the very same thing, that this, the root cause of the pandemic report that came out from the United Nations. So it's not new to Indigenous peoples. This is part of Indigenous peoples' lived reality. Is Indigenous peoples in the Americas, for lack of a better word, have faced massive environmental change and destruction, have faced pandemics and disease that wiped out a lot of the population, yet survived it all. So maybe there's something that Indigenous peoples have to say about how to work through some of this. So I just wanted to, in this slide, just point out that Indigenous peoples have been saying a lot of the same things in these reports and have been pointing to, major problems that are going to emerge from this. So again, as I pointed out, Indigenous peoples have different knowledge systems. A lot of my work is to try to, convey knowledge systems, also legal systems, because clearly the broader policy and legal framework is not working, particularly for marginalized and racialized and disadvantaged and vulnerable communities. But we did have knowledge systems that enable this that I think are relevant in this particular conversation. So some of the work that I'm doing, and I'm not the only one, I'm part of a group of physicians as well and healthcare practitioners that look at health more broadly. I think in a slightly different way than the One Health approach that looks at, we actually need to have well-being with the planet. We actually have to have well-being with the natural world and with the environment. And what does that look like? And they're starting to get more organized around these kind of concepts. But it's consistent with how Indigenous peoples think about this. And well, Anishinaabe in particular, I'm Anishinaabe, so we have this concept of Minunamadzawin, which means living a good life. And living that good life isn't just about people. It's not possible to live a good life unless the natural world, as we understand it, or all of creation also is well. That interconnection is understood. It's not even separated out per se. So it's the art of living well, and a lot of our knowledge, legal, and governance systems led towards this being able to live well with the earth. And again, it's not possible to do that unless the earth is healthy. So this is just an image of my family, because we just finished up what we call sugar bush, these practices that continue. So I started to think about, and this is some of the work that I'm working on, what does living well with the earth look like? And this is starting to become a broader goal, like it's part of the renewal of the Convention on Biodiversity, is thinking about how are people going to live in harmony with the earth? Like all of this matters in this whole conversation around COVID-19 and the environment. I particularly like this declaration. Basically, I think we need to think outside the regular box. Just tweaking with the current system isn't going to do it. The IPBES report, the IPCC report on climate change, they all pointed to there needs to be major transformation in how we do things, and literally how we think and what we value, and what does that look like? And that hasn't happened clearly, but maybe in some respects, this might be a time of opportunity to start thinking in different ways. And so I've spent time thinking about, okay, well, what if people who have had to endure a lot of these challenges that everybody now is starting to face say about this? How can we move to a more sustainable future if we understand part of the current problem is the nature of humanity's relationship to the environment and natural world. So I particularly like the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Mother Earth, a growing movement on recognizing that the earth actually has rights, most recently in Canada with Innu in February, I believe. A river is recognized as having rights, and recognizing that we have responsibilities to the future generation. So just really having to think in really innovative and transformative ways about how we want to live into the future. So a lot of my work, because I'm a Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Environmental Justice, so I have to think about that all the time. So part of some of the challenges is ongoing inequity and injustice, and the COVID-19 is really sort of showing that in all kinds of ways, even within the city of Toronto, and then how you have to kind of change the response in order to deal with these issues. Environmental racism, a recent bill just going through in Canada on that, and a lack of transformation. Like that hasn't happened yet. And we need to have that happen. And again, from an Indigenous perspective, we experience a lot of this as ongoing colonialism. It's like we've seen this before, like it's happened, and what do we need to do to move through this? So some of the work that I do is working with Indigenous communities and Indigenous youth. So how do we imagine a future? So in the work that I do, because I work a lot with youth, this topic can be like really depressing, can be really overwhelming, and what can you do? And I'm also in a lot of these other climate change, climate solutions spaces. And I think part of our inability to transform and think in innovative ways is basically our lack of imagination in a lot of cases. And a lot of the work that I do with Indigenous people, love always comes up in the conversation. Do we love future generations? Do we love the earth? Or I don't know, do we like consuming things better? So I like to point that out because I actually had a student just go through all the IPCC reports, all those. I go, does anybody ever talk about this concept? And it's not there, but it's always within an Indigenous context that central value is part of it. So that's where this comes from, a gathering that I was facilitating and the art that the youth were producing. So to me, in a lot of the work that I do, and actually this is part of a research ethics question that where I'm from, Manitoulin Island, that if you want to do research there, you actually have to answer this question. They have the teachings of the 7 grandfathers, grandmothers, and one of them is, how is your research going to show love for future generations? So I think in the work that I do is trying to ask ourselves different kind of questions. Academics are really good at diagnosing problems. We're great at that. You can give us anything and we'll point out all the problems. And maybe not as great as solutions as we could be. So a lot of my work is focused on, well, what can we do? And what kind of questions do we need to ask ourselves? I don't know if we're always asking the right questions in order to get at what might be appropriate or long-term sustainable kind of solutions. So to me, do we love our future generations? How will our work benefit future generations? How will we do that? And that's just a picture of my 2-year-old great niece in the sugar bush this last spring. So those are the things I think about when I'm doing my work. And then I wanted to leave folks with this message because in the work I do, working with Indigenous knowledge, legal systems, Indigenous peoples, people sometimes want to know what's their part in this story. So the way that we understand our relationship with the earth or planetary health is that we're all part of the story of creation that's unfolding all the time. And we get to decide who we're gonna be in that story and what we're gonna do, but we're all part of it. Everybody at every single level. And we all have obligations and responsibilities to ensure the well-being of the planet and future generations. And miigwech just means thank you. If I was at home, that's what I would be looking at. So thank you very much for your time. And apologies for, even after all this time and finishing teaching last week, I still could not figure out how to share screen. So I appreciate your patience and look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. McGregor. I think your concepts that you are bringing in an Indigenous perspective to how we have to understand health, planetary health, is so timely for the pandemic. I greatly appreciate the concept of love. I think that if we all had that, even from a public health perspective, we could see how things could be a lot better. Now I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Gabrielle Slowly. Dr. Slowly is the director of the Robarts Center for Canadian Studies and an associate professor in the Department of Politics at York. In 2017, she was the inaugural Fulbright Chair in Arctic Studies at Dartmouth College in the United States of America. Her research investigates the intersection between governance, resource extraction, Indigenous communities, northern development, the environment, and the state in multiple regions in Alberta, northern Quebec, the Yukon, Northwest Territories, Ontario, the US, Australia, and New Zealand. She's the author of Navigating Neoliberalism, Self-Determination, and the Mikisew Cree First Nation, and numerous other book chapters. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Slowly.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here today. Can you, I'm just gonna get a nod from someone. You can hear me. The slide's okay. We're ready to go.
Ready to go.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, thank you for joining me on this Saturday morning. And I know that some people might be more interested in what's going on in England at the current moment, but I'm glad you could take some time to join us. The picture, before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm Irish, from Irish Canadian, and what I'm going to talk to you today really reflects my academic journey in terms of my very first job was working for Mikisew Cree First Nation as a self-government officer out of my master's, and I've been fortunate ever since to be invited into different communities across the north of the Arctic. And so what I'm going to talk about today is a lot of my observations. So I'm going to start my timer. So what you see here in front of you and behind me, I suppose, is the picture of the antlers that line the Porcupine Caribou River in Old Crow, which is one of the most the most northern community in the Yukon Territory, and it's populated by the Gwich'in, and I'm going to be talking about them a bit. And for the Gwich'in, oh, this is not wanting to let me move my slide. Hold. Oh, there I see. For the Gwich'in, Chief Dana Tizia Tram points out, for the Gwich'in Nation, climate change and the protection of the sacred place is where life begins. Essentially, just 1 second, sorry. I wanted to make sure that we understand today what the map, the Indigenous map of North America looks like. As you can see, this is a distribution of the different Indigenous nations across North America. And you can see, for instance, the Gwich'in located up there in the top left-hand corner. But in Canada, we have a number of different treaty relationships with different First Nations. So we have historic treaties, numbered treaties that are in the pink area. We have peace and friendship treaties that predate Confederation. And more recently, we have some modern treaties and land claims that you really find across the Territory North, BC, Northern Quebec. And all of these different treaties and different communities have different relationships, not only to the environment, but also to the federal and provincial and territorial governments. And this will be important for us to understand as we go forward. Obviously, there are important observed climate changes that are occurring. As the slide points out, it presents some unique and important implications for communities that I would argue aren't dependent, but actually interdependent. As Deb was talking about, the interdependent relationship between the human and natural worlds being very symbiotic and reciprocal. But obviously for the northern communities, which have a much more have a relationship very much dependent or interdependent on the land, it can be quite profound. Most of you will have seen the iconic photos of polar bears floating away on ice floes across the Arctic. And of course, the importance of rising sea waters, which I'll talk about. For most people, climate change is focused on images like polar bears, but I would encourage us today to think about the communities and the people who live in these regions. Again, as we know that the projected temperatures are proposed to increase, and we all know that an increase of even 1 degree Celsius can have dramatic and drastic consequences for the North. One need only look at declining sea ice, which is something people like to focus on as example and evidence of the impact of this increase in heat. I remember flying out of Greenland a few years ago, and you could see actually where the glaciers and the ice shield had actually receded. It was quite a powerful visual from the plane. But you don't need to go to Greenland to see that. You can just go to Alberta or the Columbia ice fields and witness the retraction of the glaciers, and can be made very much aware of how real this transformation and how fast it's occurring. But what does this mean for people? In Tuktoyaktuk, I remember being up there and houses falling literally into the ocean because of soil erosion and thawing permafrost. So we have housing crises in many of these communities, lack of housing availability. And then of course you compound that with things like climate change and soil erosion, and you've got houses falling into the ocean. So there's a very important human impact of what's going on. We're also seeing new weather phenomena across the Arctic. Lightning strikes are not something historically a lot of people are used to seeing across the Arctic. And interestingly, it was a lightning strike that caused a catastrophic wildfire across the Tahltan First Nation, which is here located in Telegraph Creek, just south of the Yukon in northern British Columbia. So it was once this lovely, pristine forest with beautiful mountain views, rapidly became a raging inferno in 2018, requiring the communities to evacuate and bring in, BC forest fires, as well as the Yukon First Nation fire team. And when people think of these fires, they tend to think, oh, Australia or California, but the fire situation across northern Canada is actually quite concerning. So the slide went backwards. When we look at climate change, what are some of the signs? Oh, sorry about that. Obviously, wildfires, we're seeing record-breaking temperatures in the wildfire season, unexpected and unprecedented expansion of this wildfire season, which of course includes animal habitats being destroyed, which of course affects traditional hunting areas and trapping areas. We're seeing flooding, heavier precipitation, quicker melting periods, more frequent intense weather events, which leads to the destruction of property and homes, displaced families, loss of life, traditional land and environments, high costs of fighting fires, loss of employment, the rebuilding of infrastructure, and the list goes on. And of course, a lot of this is compounded by, and I'm going to talk about this a bit more about COVID, some of the challenges of lack of housing infrastructure, lack of health infrastructure, lack of basic infrastructure like roads and internet, and of course, all of this contributing to things like food insecurity and worsening mental health. In fact, people might be surprised to know, I'm sorry for the blurriness of this, that food security can be as high as almost 60% in places like Nunavut. And why is this the case? Well, there's the cost of transporting food to the north. There's the cost of actually, accessing food in the north. I remember one of the second or third times I went to Old Crow, the store had actually run out of food. And they couldn't get the Hercules up in time for at least until the end of my stay. And I remember spending an exorbitant amount of money on just nachos and salsa and trying to survive for the week. So the cost of food, making decisions about whether or not to eat or pay your heat and so forth are very important and very salient for the communities up there. So to give you an example of the ratio, there aren't a lot of reserves in the Arctic per se, but in the northern Canada there are. And of course, 50% theoretically are, according to the stats are in fact food insecure. So what are communities doing about the climate change crisis? Well, I'm excited to say that I was at the AFN National, first ever, I think, National Climate Change meeting, and Deb was there too, of course, presenting. And it was really exciting to see what the different communities are doing. Of course, as I mentioned, my first job was with Mikisew, so I stay in touch with them, and Melody is the director there of the Government Industry Relations. And she was saying, of course, that the impacts of climate change is impacting the quality, quantity, and security of traditional foods, as well as the ability to consistently bring quality food and goods into the region throughout the seasons. Again, a lot of these communities are dependent on things like ice roads. And if you only have ice roads open for 2 weeks in the winter due to temperatures, well, then it's hard to get goods flowing in and out of the community. So Mikisew, for instance, has been running a study to model and plan for these effects. They aren't alone. I mean, the Mi'kmaq are at the front lines of climate change as well. They have their own strategy in place. So there's climate adaptation in Mi'kma'ki happening. And what's interesting is the guiding principles of this, of the models that they're developing is based on something called two-eyed seeing. I believe something sort of Deb alluded to, which refers to learning to see from one eye with the strength of Indigenous knowledges and ways of knowing, and from the other eye, the strength of Western knowledges and ways of knowing, and learning to use both eyes together for the benefit of all. This concept and phrase originated with Elder Alberta Marshall from the Eskasoni First Nation. And the idea is of sustainability through a perspective of responsibility. Take the gifts of the Creator has given without compromising the resources of the earth for future generations. Now, I'm quickly going to talk to you about the experiences of two particular First Nations I've worked with, or been with, Old Crow, as I've mentioned, and of course, we're going to talk about Bearskin Lake and Treaty 9. So in May 2019, the Old Crow declared the first ever First Nation, as far as I understand, climate change state of emergency. Essentially, according to Chief Dana, it's a Gwich'in-centric declaration, one that's responsible, not alarmist. It's a response to impacts seen in plain sight. As he put it, we're seeing in the priming of furs, in the emptying of lakes, and the return of animals such as this year, the geese coming before the black ducks, which we hadn't seen before. It's about bringing that to the rest of the community nationally. And the declaration states that Indigenous people's voices aren't being heard and that governments around the world are not sufficiently responsive due to the dire circumstances already being directly experienced and the implications for the health of animal populations, food security, as well as our community's cultural, emotional, and physical well-being. And this was followed not too long after Bearskin Lake declaring a First Nation state of emergency. In November 2019, on social media, Bearskin First Nation member Joy Neben shared her harrowing tale of trying to escape the crushing ice floes threatening her community. She chronicled her journey, explaining about how few planes could land, how the road to the airport was flooded, so people had to be transported by helicopter from their houses to the airstrip, and how 75 people, mainly women, infants, and elderly, were evacuated, leaving 375 people left behind to brave the rising waters and to wait for help to arrive. Neben shared how her uncle, who grew up on the land, once knew the rivers and can't explain why the flooding has changed so much. And she wrote about feeling relief when arriving safely in Thunder Bay. In July of that year, the AFN declared its own climate state crisis as well. And featured here is Chief Marlene Poitras, also from Mikisew Cree, who is the Alberta Regional Chief. And again, citing the IPCC report, which places Canada as a top global contributor, the AFN essentially said many Indigenous peoples have been taught on the land through ceremonies and teaching. We are taught that everything has a spirit and a purpose. We have to do that by taking only what we need. It's the law of reciprocity. And according to Marlene, climate change should be a non-partisan issue. All levels of government, federal, provincial, should have an important role to play in combating climate change. And she says, we cannot wait as First Nations take on responsibility as stewards of the land to protect Mother Earth so that the children can have a future. Every person can take responsibility to lower their environmental impacts by making better choices. And for those of you, I'm a political scientist who are interested, the research I uncovered and was presented at the AFN is that the only piece of legislation that includes Indigenous peoples and the climate is the Species at Risk Act, the SARA Act, which was jointly developed. I'm going to skip through some of these. I took them from the AFN presentation. Essentially, the idea of SARA is that it must be consistent with Aboriginal and treaty rights. And again, it's the only piece of federal legislation to date that recognizes the critical role of Indigenous peoples in the administration and implementation of the Act. So skip ahead to 2020 and what happens when, oh, crikey, I'm getting over time, when COVID happens. Okay, well, up until October 20th, there were no cases in Nunavut. And in fact, the North was pretty secure. There was in September 2020 an outbreak to mining workers who flew in from the south at a remote mine, but those infections were traced and allocated to miners' home jurisdiction, keeping the Nunavut rate at 0. It was thought at the time there was little chance of outbreak because of the lack of travel between the mine and the community. And indeed, some communities put out calls saying, please stay away. Barriers were put up, and a lot of concern was about the fact that, for the Talton, the closest hospital was 600 kilometers away. They had limited healthcare facilities, lack of resources, and a lot of elders in community. Interestingly enough, two Quebec people, a couple, actually sold out their belongings, flew to Old Crow, and showed up at the beginning of the pandemic thinking they would ride the pandemic out in Old Crow. And according to Chief Tran, the man whom he did not identify expressed a fear that the pandemic was palpable. He said, the community is not prepared to accommodate those who could possibly spread the virus amongst its residents. What I informed them is that they are actually putting themselves and our community in danger because we do not have a doctor in the community, and 1/5 of our community are elders with underlying medical issues. So the couple was escorted back to the airport and sent back to Whitehorse. Fast forward to about this week, and the numbers of COVID in the north and the Arctic are shocking. You're talking about a population in the Yukon of 30,000, in Northwest Territories 35, 40,000, and same in Nunavut. So Nunavut now has approximately 395 cases. This week on Thursday, it was announced Iqaluit, the capital on Baffin Island, got its first case. They are not sure of the source of it yet. And of course, you've got to remember it takes a week for them to get their results to find out whether or not it's a variant. So on November 6th, Nunavut got its first case, and it has sort of escalated since then, because we're talking about small communities, close proximity, small housing. And so this has had a lot of negative impact on these communities. And one of the impacts, of course, is the impact on mental health. Stay-at-home orders in these small communities, which are often family-based. You're very used to being, going back and forth from house to house and visiting. The stay-at-home orders, the closing of stores, and often there's only one store in these communities, has had dramatic impact on the communities. As well as disrupted traditional governance practice. A lot of these communities still rely on face-to-face meetings, coming together in annual general meetings in order to make deliberative discussions. So while they're still having to deal with land claims and negotiations through Zoom and so forth, they're not able to meet and congregate and have deliberations in the ways they historically would. I'm about to wrap up. And as well, here in the province of Ontario, our our provincial government this summer in July, in lightning speed within its record time, passed the COVID Economic Recovery Act, Bill 197, which effectively removed environmental assessment for any new resource development projects in Northern Ontario. Of course, they did this under the everyone's preoccupation with COVID, Northern Ontario being very hard hit, being focused on inoculating elders and protecting the communities. At the same time, they passed this legislation opening up these communities to development without their consultation and without their input, raising some concerns about what could come going forward. So to conclude, finally, why am I putting this picture up of our leaders? Well, one of the reasons I was thinking about this is COVID, we hope, as we just went into a deep lockdown in Ontario, is going to pass eventually. However, climate change has been recognized, acknowledged as it's not going anywhere anytime fast. And it's something I would like, and I would echo Deb's call, that we all think about in terms of what are our responsibility and how can we be part of the solution. So going forward, I'd say that, yes, we all have to deal with COVID, but we cannot forget the daily impact that at the same time that these communities in the North are fighting COVID, they're still fighting the climate change crisis. And I would argue and I encourage us all as Canadians to think about what we can do, how we can help, and remember that the climate change crisis isn't going anywhere. So to keep that in mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Slowey, for that very informative talk. Now I'd like to move on to our next speaker, Dr. James Stinson. Dr. James Stinson is a cultural anthropologist who specializes in political ecology and human-environment relations. His research is focused on the management of national parks and protected areas in Canada and Latin America, and the participation of Indigenous peoples' nature conservation. His current research involves working with the youth from the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation to document Indigenous conceptions of and responses to climate change on Lake Huron and Georgian Bay. Welcome, Dr. Stinson, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me to be here today. It's a real honor to be part of this panel. I also would just like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you today from my home, which is situated in the traditional territory of several Indigenous peoples, including the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation. Let me just share my screen. So today I'm going to be speaking about the impacts of the pandemic, of the COVID-19 pandemic on parks and conservation areas, with a particular focus on the Canadian and North American context. I would like to begin by saying that much of the research that I've been doing in this area has been conducted through a SSHRC-funded project, Canadian Conservation in Global Context, which aimed to study and situate recent policy and programming shifts at Parks Canada within a larger comparative global context. My work has specifically examined efforts to reframe Canadian parks as sites of health promotion. So over the last 10 years, there's been a growing recognition that the health benefits of connecting to nature. This awareness has been promoted in part through the emergence of the international Healthy Parks, Healthy People movement, which was founded by Parks Victoria of Australia in the early 2000s, and which had its first global congress in 2010. Healthy Parks, Healthy People aims to promote the power of parks and public lands in promoting human health and well-being. In 2014, the Canadian Parks Council, which is a collaboration of all federal, provincial, and territorial parks agencies across Canada, launched their Connecting Canadians with Nature campaign, aimed at promoting the health and well-being of Canadians through park visitation. And this is framed as a Canadian version of this international Healthy Parks, Healthy People movement. This growing interest in the recognition of the health benefits of nature has coincided with a significant boom in outdoor recreation over the past decade. After years of stagnating and even declining visitation to parks and protected areas, through the 1990s and early 2000s, the numbers of visitors to Canadian national parks has increased over 30% in the last 10 years, from just over 12 million people to over 16 million people in 2019. National parks in the United States have seen similar increases over the same period, with the park system there seeing 327 million visits in 2019, which was 9 million more than the previous year. As the first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic hit North America in March of 2020, already crowded parks saw a surge in visitors seeking to escape to the outdoors, sometimes overwhelming facilities, staff, and gateway communities, even as public health officials urged people to practice physical distancing or stay at home. An influx of visitors to the town of Canmore, British Columbia, for instance, which is just east of Banff National Park's gates, led to concerns from residents about the increasing risk of COVID-19 in places and small communities with limited healthcare facilities. Similar concerns were raised by park staff and gateway communities throughout Canada and across the United States. This led to widespread closure of many parks across North America throughout the spring of 2020. During the early days of this first lockdown last year, social media was flooded with reports of nature hitting the reset button, of air pollution disappearing, of wildlife returning to formerly abandoned landscapes and environments. According to one widely shared story online, dolphins and swans had returned to the newly clear waters in the canals of Venice. While many of these stories were subsequently debunked, conservationists and park staff around the world have provided legitimate reports of the lockdown and reduced human pressures having positive impacts on park environments and wildlife. In protected areas, declines in visitor numbers caused by travel restrictions and park closures have reduced stresses on sensitive environments and trampling pressure on popular trails. For those biologists able to continue research through the pandemic, the lockdowns created a unique opportunity to observe how animal populations respond to the rapid and dramatic reduction in visitation and recreation. Throughout the Americas, conservationists recorded increasing sightings of wildlife returning to formerly abandoned environments, and of wildlife becoming more active. Camera traps set up by the University of British Columbia biologists in Golden Ears Provincial Park in British Columbia, for instance, captured amazing footage of wildlife, including cougars and bears, and rangers noted that some animals were becoming more active during the day. You can see one of the camera trap images up here on the slide that was posted on Instagram. In Yosemite National Park in California, where 400 bears have been hit by cars since 1995, staff noted that reduced noise and air pollution and a surge had led to a surge of animals throughout the park's fields and open spaces. Asked in a Facebook Live event how animals had responded to the park's closure, a ranger responded, quote, "For the most part, I think they're having a party." However, while there have been preliminary reports of positive impacts of parks and wildlife, while there have been preliminary reports of positive impacts of the lockdowns on parks and wildlife populations, the pandemic has also made it more difficult to study and monitor these spaces. Biologists and park organizations have noted the pandemic has made it extremely difficult to interview, hire, train, house, and supervise seasonal staff, including research staff. Field research has been impacted, with many field sites no longer accessible because of travel and entry restrictions and safety concerns. With biological monitoring programs restricted, it's difficult to know at this point what the overall impact of the pandemic has been. In other cases, as the previous speaker just mentioned, governments have taken advantage of the COVID-19 pandemic to weaken environmental laws and regulations. Examples include proposals to de-reserve provincial parks and to allow for coal mining in sensitive environments in Alberta, and the recent move in Ontario to limit the ability of conservation authorities to regulate development in sensitive wetlands. It's also important to note that in many countries, the disruption of international tourism has robbed park agencies, as well as neighboring communities, of crucial revenue used to support conservation, which often acts as a deterrent to hunting for the sale of wildlife or plants on the illegal wildlife trade. With reduced staff and monitoring, communities facing the economic stress of lost tourism revenues, lockdowns have made it more difficult to combat poaching, logging, and other sources of resource extraction within parks. In other instances, park closures have turned parks into safe havens for criminal organizations or militant groups. In April 2020, for example, 12 park rangers were killed in a national park in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is also home to critically endangered mountain gorillas. So during the first lockdown, a colleague and I wrote an article about park closures, arguing that these closures represented an opportunity to rethink the balance between parks and visitation and environmental protection. However, while the lockdowns provided a temporary reprieve for some animals from the disturbance of human visitors, throughout much of North America, this proved short-lived. As lockdowns were lifted and parks reopened, visitation has in many cases continued to rise rapidly. By all accounts, demand for access to parks and conservation areas is now at an all-time high. As Parks Ontario noted in a recent Facebook post, the online reservation system has seen its highest volume of traffic ever. On March 2nd, Ontario Parks reported over 34,000 users logged into their online booking system between 6:30 and 7:30 a.m., which represented a 200% increase from the same day and time the previous year. There have also recently been reports of and rumors of bots being programmed to book up large blocks of campsites for resale on secondary markets on sites like Kijiji or Facebook Marketplace. I just saw ads last night on Kijiji for campsites in Killarney National Park for a few days there, going for over $300. And finally, regional conservation authorities have been experiencing similar increases in visitation, with some municipalities and local conservation organizations, including Grey Bruce, experiencing at least a 50% increase and warning of the problems associated with what they're calling over-tourism. A 2016 State of the Parks report by Parks Canada found that 46% of national park ecosystems were in just fair and poor condition at that time. This increase in visitation has been putting even more stress on these already stressed environments in conservation areas. Throughout the pandemic, parks across North America have faced issues with littering and waste disposal, particularly with reduced staff and the closure of some park visitor facilities. Parks in the US have noted the accumulation of litter on trails and around campsites, graffiti, and even human waste along trails and around campsites due to the closure of washroom facilities. Ontario parks have similarly reported widespread littering as well as overcrowded trails and backcountry camping sites. Ontario Parks pointed out the problem on its Facebook page and website, posting pictures of trash piling up on beaches, park campgrounds, and washrooms. Another issue has been with traffic and parking, with popular parks such as Bruce Peninsula National Park in Ontario, experiencing traffic jams and roadsides congested with vehicles. Even smaller rural municipalities have been experiencing issues with traffic and parking, creating dangerous and crowded conditions at access points and trailheads. So in conclusion, I want to emphasize that while the pandemic has had some positive impacts on parks, by temporarily relieving wildlife from the pressures of the intrusions of human visitors, the overall results are much more mixed. As reduced biological monitoring and research capabilities, reduced tourism revenues, increasing threats from poaching and violent crime, and the rapidly increasing visitation following the lifting of lockdowns has put even more pressure on these environments, particularly as more and more of us seek the outdoors as a physical and mental antidote to the isolation and stress of the pandemic. Finally, while there are many ways to address these issues moving forward, I'm inspired by the work of some of the youth I've been working with from the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, particularly in terms of rethinking what it means to engage with the non-human world to promote health and well-being. On March 20th, youth from the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation engaged in a 19-kilometer water walk to raise awareness and seek healing in the context of a serious opioid epidemic in their community. In this case, these youth did not seek to attain the health benefits of nature as consumers of an external wilderness experience, but petitioned and prayed for healing through an act of stewardship and caretaking aimed at recognizing and respecting the life and life-giving power of water that resides in us all. Moving forward and hopefully out of this pandemic, a renewed emphasis and acknowledgement of the reciprocal relationship between human and non-human well-being could help us foster both healthy parks and healthy people moving into the future. Thank you very much. I look forward to hearing your questions and engaging with your feedback.
Thank you, Dr. Stinson, for that very thought-provoking talk about the connection between our own nature, our controlled nature, and the pandemic, and how this impact on our national parks and our provincial parks. So now I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Kennedy. Dr. Eric Kennedy is an assistant professor of disaster and emergency management at York University. His research focuses on the human, social, and policy dimensions of emergency management. Dr. Kennedy is the director of the Collaboration on Emergency Management, Policy, and Preparedness Research Lab at York University, and runs a Science Outside the Lab program to help train the next generation of policy leaders. Welcome, Dr. Kennedy. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me, and to all the other speakers for absolutely fantastic talks so far. It's been a delight to learn from you all, and I appreciate you taking the time on a Saturday morning to be with us. As mentioned, I'm a professor of emergency management, which means two things. Number one, I have a lot that I want to share with you today. And number two, I have not gotten a lot of sleep over the past year for the abundance of work. But I'm excited to be able to talk through these issues and for the questions that you have, so please feel free to share them in the chat. I've had the privilege over the past year of running a national project monitoring the social dimensions of COVID-19. So we've been tracking how Canadians are impacted by the pandemic, the kinds of beliefs and attitudes that they have, and the kinds of actions that they're taking. Using thousands of interviews and surveys from coast to coast to coast, we've been trying to monitor their experiences and better understand how this is impacting the average Canadian. But outside of that context, I'm actually a fire researcher. I study forest fire and bushfire and wildfire and try to understand how we as humans live with these natural threats, how we're connected to the very nature of those threats and their existence, and how we make decisions around managing things like raging infernos. And so I think this picture really encapsulates quite a bit of what I do in my work right now in terms of the wearing a mask and socially distancing at the same time as we see this incredible fire landscape burning around it. And I think in many ways there are lots of connections between the coronavirus and what we might learn from or see in forest fire. In fact, if you've been watching the news, you've probably heard all sorts of these analogies. Talks of fanning the flame of infection, or the disease spreading like wildfire, or a new hotspot that's being sparked. The language of forest fire is leaned on quite often to try to understand what's happening in COVID. In fact, Premier Ford yesterday during his press conference referred to the province as being in an inferno that was burning through the province as a whole. And so I think many people see these kinds of connections. And what I want to do today is to talk through two dimensions of them. We'll start off with some of the literal connections, the ways that fire impacts COVID, and conversely, COVID has impacted how we have to manage fire. And then we'll turn our eyes to three lessons that I think we learn from looking at wildfires as a natural disaster and can apply to the management of COVID, and the ways that, in fact, fire is revealed to be a very human disaster too, that it's our choices and our decisions that create the fire regimes we're faced with today. So let's start off with some of those literal connections between the two. One thing that we might look at is the way that wildfire has impacted the coronavirus in Canada and around the world. So one direct impact that fires can have is that they create these kinds of hotspots that are prone to transmission. So when you think about a fire situation, and the kinds of evacuations that are needed. For instance, if you have people coming out of individual homes and moving into large collective evacuation centers, like pictured in the upper right here, that creates a situation where it's understandably a lot harder to keep the virus in check. Similarly, even your mode of transportation to get there. If you think about communities that would have to be on buses or planes for hours and hours to get out to that evacuation location, that's another kind of ripe location for the transmission of COVID. And firefighters themselves are not immune either. Firefighters work in very close quarters. They get packed into helicopters and vans. They live in fire camps and often shared accommodations that are quite prone to the spread of disease. Another thing that fire can do to COVID is exacerbate respiratory conditions. In the bottom right here, we see a model of where smoke was moving from Alberta across much of the continent following fires in 2019. And the kinds of smoke plumes we can get are really quite significant, and they affect people who have difficulty breathing or underlying medical conditions. And as you can imagine, exacerbating respiratory conditions during a pandemic that affects your respiratory system is not really a recipe for success, whether that's in terms of directly infecting or affecting people who are already infected, or in terms of just the increased burden on healthcare. Finally, fires can suck up a lot of resources. The people responding need personal protective equipment. They need the gear to respond. We need the personnel and the incident command folks to respond. And so competing demand for things as simple as respirators and masks and gloves can be a challenge posed by a high fire load, like our previous speakers have hinted at under climate change. But COVID can also impact fire as well. And I'll give you just a couple of quick tastes of how that happens. So one reality is that the way we've built our fire management systems, not just in Canada, but around the world, depends on trading and sharing personnel to keep things somewhat affordable and to keep things working. But moving personnel around between provinces and around the globe becomes very challenging under a global pandemic. And we've seen cases of firefighters who were on exchange before in one of these kinds of delegations, unfortunately being infected while they're on exchange to another jurisdiction. COVID can also reduce the number of firefighters that you have available at any given moment. If they have to be more spaced out on the fire line, if they can't work in as large a group, that's an impact. And in some jurisdictions like California that still use prisoner inmates to fight fires, if your prison is a hotspot for COVID infections, that has the potential of impacting your supply of firefighters if you're depending on inmates as part of your firefighting operations. We've also seen in the Canadian context some difficulty convincing community members to evacuate from a fire risk to a town that has COVID. Right? The concern about the threat of where we're going to is quite prominent. So those are some of the ways that fire is literally connected to COVID-19. But there, I think, are some other more abstract connections that we can make in terms of understanding lessons learned from fire and applying them to the case of COVID. So I'll wrap up with just 3 quick lessons that I think we can take away. The first one is that the more I study fire managers, and I study people like the one pictured here in the right image, right? The people at the command centers making the decisions. The more you study these folks, the more you realize that fire management is all about managing knowledge. We need to know where the fire is going to spread, where it started, what tactics might work. And as much as we need boots on the ground and hoses, and we need planes in the sky, right? The majority of whether your firefight is going to work or not depends on the quality of your knowledge. Do you know where the spread is occurring? Do you know what interventions will be most effective? Can your personnel on the ground communicate effectively with the people making the decisions or not? In other words, effective emergency management really depends on high quality, real-time knowledge being transmitted effectively within your organization. And I think one of the things we're going to see in the wake of COVID is that a lot of the challenges in managing the response have arisen because of perhaps less effective knowledge exchange within organizations, just like we see breakdown in the case of fighting forest fires. A second lesson that comes out of my research in wildfire is that I think we need to be aware of the strengths, but also the weaknesses of modeling. So when I'm talking about models, you're likely familiar with weather forecasts and economic predictions and all these other sorts of predictions about the future. But we see all sorts of predictions and forecasts being made about COVID conditions as well. If you tuned into the news conference yesterday, for instance, we saw Doug Ford hold up a sheet of paper that showed different lines of how the virus will behave in Ontario, depending on what interventions we make. Models can be useful because they help us to guess at what the conditions in the future might be. And they help us to predict how some of these interventions might affect those future conditions. But as I've written about in the publication Pictured and elsewhere, I think we also have to be really careful with models and remember that models can't tell us what we should or ought to do. These are questions of values, of priorities. These are questions where we have to have those messy debates about what we're trying to achieve. And I'm going to share some data here that we actually haven't shared before from our most recent round of COVID surveys. But we asked Canadians from coast to coast to coast about what they thought the government priority would be. And about a third of them said that the priority should be doing what New Zealand did, right? Eliminating COVID entirely. Another third said our priority should be reducing the levels significantly and then learning to live with it. And then another third said that the priority should be focusing just on those people who are at risk and protecting them. These kinds of different priorities and different values can make it really hard to know what the right course of action is and how to use the models if we don't have those difficult debates about where we're trying to go. The models can function as a GPS in your car, but if 3 different people have steering wheels and are trying to go different directions, it's not going to be terribly effective. The final lesson that I would share here is that fire reminds us to be aware of using individual solutions as the response to systematic problems. And I think we've seen this hinted at in the previous presentations as they've mentioned things like the way climate is increasing the potential for forest fires. There are 2 common tropes that show up when we're talking about forest fires. One is the trope that we can rely on individuals to save us all. And there's a relatively tragic photo here to the right, which was taken by the Granite Mountain hotshots in Arizona just before they were burned over in attempting to protect a community from those oncoming flames. Making this about individual heroes saving the day for the rest of us is really challenging. But we also often see rhetoric of if people only just made the right decisions, we could fix this problem. Or if they only just understood the science, we could fix this problem. And I think fire cautions us there too. It tells us that sometimes individuals might not have the opportunity, the capacity, or the agency to be able to make the changes they want to make. This photo is from Paradise, California, which was a disproportionately elderly and low socioeconomic status area. If you're someone who doesn't have great mobility, it's going to be hard for you to clean your eaves troughs at home. Or if you're someone living in a congregate care setting, you might not have much ability to make decisions about how to improve your property. And I think these analogs are really present in COVID-19. When we look at the places that are disproportionately affected, that are hotspots, these are places where people have work that makes them vulnerable, where they don't feel like they can risk losing their job by speaking up, where they have to take riskier behaviors as a result of decision-making by their boss or by the government. And we've seen some really unfortunate data here. This was in the most recent release about the way that those who are facing the most risk, so those over here with neighborhoods and the highest level of incidence of infection, are the ones who have received the least vaccine so far. And so this isn't to say that individual solutions aren't important, but just that we have to be cautious about seeing them as the only answer and the fix for everything. Now with that, I can't wait to hear from the final speaker, and then I'm really looking forward to discussion, but I hope this reflection on the connections between wildfire helps to spur on some conversation as we go forward. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kennedy, about teaching us what we can learn from natural disaster management and fire, particularly with the pandemic that's burning so hot right now, particularly in Ontario. So before, I just one reminder before we go on to our next speaker. After the final presentation, we will be hosting a panel discussion and taking questions from you in the audience. If you'd like to submit a question, please just go to the bottom of your screen and use the Q&A button at the bottom. I will pose as many of your questions to the panelists as time permits. Now I'd like to introduce our final speaker, Mark Winfield. Dr. Winfield is a professor of Environmental Studies at York University. He is also co-chair of the faculty's Sustainable Energy Initiative and coordinator of the Joint Master of Environmental Studies Juris Doctorate program offered in conjunction with Osgoode Hall Law School. He's published articles, books, chapters, and reports on a wide range of climate change, environment, and energy law and policy topics. Dr. Winfield has acted as an advisor to the Environmental Commission of Ontario and Federal Commissioner for the Environment and Development. Welcome, Dr. Winfield. We're pleased to have you here today.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you, Rebecca. I'm going to see if I can make the screen sharing work. We're doing for a group of professors who are supposed to be pros at this. We all seem to be having some challenges, but let's see how this works. There we go. Thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the impact of COVID-19 on the environment, but also some larger questions around longer term implications for sustainability and governance as well. So I'm going to touch on four themes, and one of the things that's come up a lot has been the notion of COVID-19 as an inflection point. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what do we know about the impacts on the environment, particularly in areas like climate change so far. James talked a bit about parks and wildlife as well already, and we've heard from Gabrielle and Deb a bit too as well. I'm going to talk about the sorts of responses we've seen from governments at a policy level or a strategy level in terms of implications for the environment, a little bit about long-term behavioral effects in terms of how this may be changing the way in which people behave, which then may be where the bigger impacts in the longer term come from, and then touch a little bit on the question, which is very poignant this morning in Ontario, of where do we go from here? In terms of direct impacts, at least in the very short term, with respect to, for example, to greenhouse gas emissions and also air pollutants that cause smog, there was initially a fairly positive impact as economic activity declined very rapidly. The downside here is this is turning out to have been decidedly very, very temporary in terms of its impacts. We sort of bottomed out somewhere about a year ago and have been quietly drifting back up in terms of greenhouse gas emissions overall since then. So in terms of the overall impacts on the climate trajectory that the IPCC has talked about and Gabrielle was talking about in terms of impacts in the north, this doesn't make very much difference at all. We've seen some other areas of impact not fully documented, but also on the downside, increases in generation of material waste, obviously biomedical waste flowing from infection control precautions in the healthcare sector, but also increases in amounts of packaging waste associated with the sort of delivery economy that we've ended up in as well. So in terms of direct immediate impacts, we certainly haven't made much progress and may be seeing the emergence of new problems. We have seen some other significant fallouts in terms of behavior, which may have longer term impacts. One, of course, has been, and we're in the midst of an exercise of this right now, which of course is the viability of remote working models, at least if you happen to be a relatively white collar worker. Telecommuting and distance work now seems to look much more viable than we thought it was. Some of that is because the technology, including the Zoom platform that we're using right now, really only sort of came together in a relatively short time period just before the pandemic, that these things really sort of matured to the point where their widespread use was actually feasible. At the other end, we've also seen and been reminded powerfully of the importance of what you might term doers in areas like healthcare, food production and distribution, but also seen some very, very powerful reminders of how precarious the employment models have become in these sectors. And very notable yesterday, again, the government of Ontario unable to bring itself to even deal with the issue of paid sick leave, something which folks with the subject matter expertise around infectious disease and epidemiology have been screaming for some time. We've also been very powerfully reminded of the vulnerability of global supply chains, or initially around personal protective equipment and ventilators. Now we're sort of dealing with the consequences of not having domestic vaccine production. And more broadly, we've had other events which have kind of reminded us of just how fragile supply chains have become. We've engaged in this fairly huge trade-off through the process of globalization of efficiency gains on one side, but fairly enormous losses in terms of resiliency on the other. And that may cause some rethinking down the road. How governments have responded has been very sort of split. In some cases, what you've got is a lot of discussion is sort of framed around discourses of returning to normal. And this has then tended to result in a kind of doubling down on established paths, policy decisions which tend to favor strong incumbents. The Ontario government is probably a very good example of this, although there's more dimensions of that, Alberta as well. Versus those who've seen the COVID and the sort of investments which are now scheduled to occur in response as an opportunity to build back better. Certainly language we've seen from the incoming Biden administration in the United States, and to a certain degree from our own federal government, although on the whole, Canadian governments have very much been in the return to normal pathway. We've actually seen supports for fossil fuels, a number of different ways actually increase. We're waiting to see what the federal government does in terms of the upcoming budget and where it intends to make investments. I think there's some big questions about how well targeted some of those investments might be and how we're going to make those decisions. And of course, as we heard from James and Gabrielle, there's also been this phenomena, particularly for the double downers, that COVID-19 has been something of a mega policy window, and a great deal has been moved through the system under the cover of COVID management or COVID recovery. As we heard mentioned, the evisceration of the environmental assessment process in Ontario. These things have been very, very pronounced around land use planning as well. The use of ministerial zoning orders, the constraining of the role of conservation authorities, huge investments back into highway infrastructure, which sort of takes us backwards in terms of how we approach urban form. In terms of public responses, a couple of things do seem to be emerging, and this indeed may be where some of the bigger long-term impacts, at least within Canada and more specifically Ontario, may play out, is we're seeing a lot of anecdotal evidence around an exodus from the urban core, especially in Toronto, towards the suburbs and exurbia. We're seeing lots of discussion around increases in house prices and demand in Simcoe, Muskoka, Kawartha Lakes. There was a story even about Tillsonburg in the Globe last week. So there does seem to be a move away from dense urban environments outwards. We also have seen dramatic decline in reliance on public transit, either if those who can work from home simply not traveling. If they do need to, they tend to do so by automobile. The folks who are left on transit, sadly, are those who have no choice. They turn out to be essential workers, and among those who are turning out to be most vulnerable. This raises all kinds of questions about viability of transit from an economic perspective, and these, of course, are transit services are part of how we would think we would be decarbonizing transportation. That looks a lot more difficult now, and that kind of leads into this other question that our assumptions, particularly in the Greater Toronto area, about how we were going to manage population growth, especially, have largely focused on the notion that we would densify and intensify, that we would try and build upwards rather than outwards. And what we're seeing, of course, with this move to the suburbs and exurbia is a very clear indication that the housing choices and preferences seem to be shifting to much lower density development patterns. That has quite significant long-term implications in terms of the environment in Ontario, Southern Ontario, especially in the GTA, because of course that lower density housing is going to be built on prime agricultural land, very high value natural heritage assets like the Oak Ridges moraine. It has potential implications around transportation patterns that are effectively embedding development forms which are going to be very, very difficult to service with transit, and in some cases, depending on design, or active transportation is difficult as well. So this is very challenging from the perspective of how we thought we would manage urban growth and what urban form would look like. We're hearing from developers, for example, that high-rise office is simply not viable. We see record vacancy rates for rental apartments, especially high-rise. So that's also a function of the economic distress caused by the pandemic. And the condominium market is in Toronto is I think an uncertainty at best. But there's real questions about is the types of housing that we thought we were going to build, the types of communities, really going to be what people are going to want in the context of the longer impacts of the pandemic. We've seen a few other things as well. We don't know how far this is really going to go. Certainly this question of the vulnerability and fragility of supply chains has led to discussions about onshoring of critical supply chains. We've seen this a little bit around PPE and vaccines. There's some hint in some discussions around manufacturers of other types of products that they've been shocked at how fragile their supply chains turned out to be. That may or may not lead to reconsideration of how much do we want to onshore versus continue to rely on very, very long supply chains. I think the final slide, just to sort of transition into the discussion, is I think we're left with a lot of questions about where do we go from here. As of today and yesterday, it doesn't look very good in Ontario. We are waiting to see what the federal government decides to do, particularly in terms of expenditure. It sort of talks about building back better like Mr. Biden, but we're going to have to see how this really plays out. The province, for its part, as I say, it seems to be very much a double downer on conventional trajectories and already established incumbent actors. So I don't think we see very much in terms of transitional strategy there. Indeed, this seems to be in some ways part of the Ford government struggle. It's simply uncomfortable with the notion of the state or government playing a large positive role in decision making and delivery of services. And some have argued this partially explains the difficulties that it's had in managing the pandemic, that this is just not a space in which they're particularly comfortable in terms of how they think about their role as government. I think I'll leave off there and we can move into the discussion phase. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Winfield, for sharing your concepts about the politics and ending, about how we can move forward. So I think with that, I'm going to ask all of our speakers to turn their cameras and microphones on for the question and answer and panel discussion. I'm going to encourage our audience to submit questions about the intersection of the pandemic and the environment. So I'm going to start focusing on some of the questions that address some of these issues. The first one that I'm going to ask is from Silva Redigonda. There are people who still deny that COVID-19 and climate change exists, global warming exists. Aside from trying to educate these people, what can be done to actually make concrete changes? And I'll just open it up to anybody who wants to take the idea. So I guess it's really about some of the lessons we're learning with climate change and now trying to educate and get behavioral change in the pandemic in that context. Any thoughts? Or who'd like to start? Mark.
Sure. I must admit, I do think the deny camp is getting smaller. And I think, you know, we're seeing signs of that in different places. I think even the announcement we saw from the Federal Conservative Party, notwithstanding his difficulties with his party, acknowledging the reality of climate change sort of tells us, at least on that front, that we've sort of moved into a new reality. I think the COVID deniers are probably an even smaller constituency. On climate, what we seem to be getting is now a kind of denial 2.0, which is more to admit, yes, the problem is real, but the costs of dealing with it are too complicated. What we might do is too marginal in its impact, and that therefore we're just going to have to live with it. Seems to be where that discourse is going. But I think with the departure of the great denier to the south, and the shift in the politics in Canada, we seem to be, at least on the climate side, we're sort of entering, I hope, the end of that part of the discourse and into much more of a what do we do discourse, but there then trying to move that conversation, move forward fast enough to avoid the sort of outcomes the IPCC has talked about is going to be its own set of challenges.
Thank you. Any of the other panelists want to talk about lessons learned or any of the ideas of dealing with climate denial, climate change denial, and COVID-19 intersection or the similarities? Okay, I think I'll go to another question. This is from Noreen Chan. How can we enjoy our national parks responsibly and respect nature and the animals? Perhaps I'll start with, is it James? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think in terms of visitation, I think one of the positive things we've seen over the last few years is that parks are now emphasizing that visiting parks does have health benefits. And I think that that's a really positive change in emphasizing the benefits to humans that we can get from visiting parks. But, you know, as I was saying in my talk, that this increasing visitation does have negative impacts on the environment at the same time. So I think, you know, I think that there are multiple ways we can approach this. You know, I think on one level, there's a leave no trace ethic that I think is important to promote. But I think as well, you know, one of the point that I was trying to end with in my talk was that I think we can do more than try to just leave no trace as consumers in nature. And I think that we could do a lot more to think about engaging with nature in a positive way in terms of how we can, protect nature and care for nature as we engage with it at the same time. So I think we could improve some of the messaging around that. You know, I've thought a lot about the Healthy Parks, Healthy People movement. And I think one of the issues with that movement, one of the issues that I have with that movement is it clearly emphasizes how, and there's a lot of research on how nature can provide health benefits to humans, but there's a lot less clear data about how human visitation in nature actually benefits the environment. There's a lot of sort of anecdotal talk about how visiting and connecting to nature is going to turn people into conservationists or environmentalists moving forward and increase support for conservation. But how that actually benefits nature in a real material way, I think is still up in the air. So I think in terms of that movement, Healthy Parks, Healthy People, there's a lot of work that we need to do in thinking about how visitation is going to benefit nature in really practical ways. Some of the other things I think we could think about would be, you know, creating more protected areas so that visitation is dispersed and not concentrated in certain areas, so there could be less impacts there. Creating more parks and green spaces in urban environments as well, which I think this pandemic has really highlighted a need for. I think one of the things that I've seen online just in the last 24 hours, you know, since these new, more restrictive COVID measures have been put in place is is an outrage over the closing of parks, particularly for children and youth in urban areas, and the inequity of that that creates. So yeah, I think there's a lot of work to be done in these areas for sure.
Would anybody else like to comment on this?
I think there's an interesting thing that you hinted at there, James, around nature and the many ways that nature can be manifest. And this shows up a lot in my work on fire, because everyone will talk about protecting natural resources. And if you ask 10 people what wild or nature means, you'll get 15 different answers. In times, they're in conflict with each other. For instance, if you're a fan of caribou, you have a very different prescription of what a good natural fire regime is than if you're a fan of moose. These animals prefer different frequencies of fires and intensities of fire. And so protecting nature can look different depending on what kind of nature you're trying to protect. And so I think there's some exciting room for pluralism and for questioning some of our assumptions about what wilderness is and what nature is, because the way we conceive of it is not the only way that it can be conceived of. And I think it's important to consider leaving room for different kinds of nature and different kinds of interactions with nature too.
I think what I'll add to what Eric and James said, because I think I really like how, Eric, what you just talked about in terms of nature, because in these COVID times, and most people are urban and in urban areas, I think people could probably interact with nature maybe a little bit better in urban spaces. Like just to recognize that it's actually here. I mean, I admit I spend a lot of time in parks because I need to kind of be outside, like, you know, away from people riding my bike. And there'd clearly be signs that say, do not go here because we're trying to, you know, regenerate this particular area, and people are all over it. And I think so there needs to be some kind of balance or approach. I think, and as Eric pointed out, different ways of appreciating nature, not just parks. People can't go there right now, but we can still go outside, you know, for health reasons or walk the dog or whatever else, right? So, but nature is actually all around us. So I think this actually might be a time, I'm reluctant to say opportunity, to maybe, you know, try to convey or teach people, maybe as part of public health, to interact and treat nature in a really respectful way. It's not just there for our use, but it has value in and of itself, and the relationship should be reciprocal. How do we take care of it? What can we do that actually benefits nature? And that also includes wildlife, like wildlife that we might see. Just looking out my window, I'm looking at squirrels running around. So it's yeah, I just thought I would add that, like, here it's kind of an opportunity to do that, because literally we can't go to the parks, but we can be outside and you can see, like, anyway, that's all I'll add to that, because I think, you know, there's an opportunity to do that in this time.
Thank you. The next question comes from one of our professors. Kate, tell us that. For Deborah and James, what are the top 2 insights that Indigenous youth are giving us, and how can we hear and support them as they're trying to live well in the pandemic?
You waiting for me to go first, James? Like,
Sure.
like, I can start, and then you can jump in relation to your research. Probably the number one priority that I find in the work that I do with youth is being able to connect with the land, with elders, in an intergenerational sort of approach in relation to the land, wherever they happen to be, whether they're in urban areas or in First Nation communities or other kind of communities that they're in. So this means support of language initiatives. Like, I look at actually language revitalization as climate change action in an Indigenous context, because that builds resilience in communities. So this is what they've been saying consistently, and it actually doesn't even really matter what we're talking about. That's what they'll say. And ironically, despite, you know, the perceived big generational gap between youth and elders actually say the same thing. They're like, we really need to connect with youth in order to enable knowledge sharing, passing on of knowledge, and learning about our own traditions and our own identity. So anything that's going to strengthen that in Indigenous communities and youth needs to be supported, and others can learn from that too, because as I mentioned before, a lot of what people are facing, Indigenous peoples have already faced, and we've come out the other side. So there's probably, I think there's things that people can learn from Indigenous peoples as well. So that's a great question, Kate. So I'll turn it over to James to speak to his research.
Yeah, I think what I would add to that, I mean, the research that I'm doing with Indigenous youth is pretty new to me still, so I'm very much still learning in this area. But I think the thing that has stood out to me the most is that, even though a lot of Indigenous youth are hurting right now in difficult situations, that one of the main messages that has really stood out to me is that we and they want to take up their responsibility to care for the environment and to highlight, that need to care for the environment. And as I was saying in my talk, that this idea isn't just about engaging with nature to benefit them as individuals, but what they can do in this time to highlight and really promote that reciprocal relationship between people and the environment. I shared that slide about the water walk that took place in Saugeen First Nation 2 or 3 weeks ago. I think that's a really good example of that. Just over the last few days, that same group of youth and women and youth and community members engaged in another water walk to a proposed nuclear storage site in southwestern Ontario to highlight the fact that they want to take up their responsibility to care for the earth in that context and to raise awareness about the potential impacts of that particular nuclear storage project. So I think that's the thing that has stood out for me, is just that awareness and that desire to not just sort of, as I was saying, consume the health benefits of nature, but to think about and take up that responsibility to care for nature as well. And I guess one last thing I would say, sorry, is it thinking about nature in a very different way as well. Just not thinking about nature as sort of inert resources that we can exploit, but as something that has its own agency in life, giving power as well.
It's rights, as Deb kind of talked to us about earlier, rivers having rights. The next question is from Wendy Hooker. How can we effectively control the disastrous litter waste and human waste in our Toronto Lake Edge parks, since there are no restrictions on what people bring in and how many people use the parks on a daily level? Provincial parks restrict numbers and monitor use to prevent degradation.
Sorry, could you just repeat the first part of that question?
Sure. How can we effectively control the disastrous litter waste and human waste in our popular Toronto Lake parks, as there are no restrictions? I guess it's the idea of the municipal parks versus the provincial and federal parks.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the reasons why litter, I think, has been such a big problem during the pandemic is that a lot of park staff has been cut back significantly. And things like waste disposal and facilities have been closed down in many cases. So that's been one of the things that's been leading to a lot of the litter issues in parks, as well as because of increased visitation. But I think, as I was saying, increasing messaging around the importance of leaving no trace is important. I think increasing waste disposal facilities is something that's increasingly important as more and more people do visit parks, even in small rural communities like the town where I'm living, as we've seen an influx of visitors from places like Toronto during the pandemic. And there's been a lot of talk around the need for new visitor facilities, like, just simple things like garbage cans on public streets that don't exist right now, washroom facilities, all these things. Yeah.
Mark, please.
Yeah, I mean, this also highlights some other dimensions of this, in the sense of infrastructure just not keeping up, especially in relatively dense urban environments. We've done also relatively little to add actual park space. I mean, all the things James mentioned in terms of just very basic infrastructure like garbage cans and their maintenance and washrooms and things like that. But there's also, as we've densified urban environments, I mean, exactly what we saw was when people were released on the first lockdown, they were desperate to find open space, and we haven't been building that or providing that as we've been going through these processes of densification. I live in Midtown Toronto, so we're very familiar with it, where we were just told by the city that to deal with the levels of population being brought into the area, you would need another full-scale park on the size of four or five full-scale playing fields. But mostly that's just open space where people can be a little bit in nature. And we haven't been dealing with those infrastructure needs.
Thank you. The next question comes from John Peel. Do our leaders stress strongly enough that personal responsibility is essential? Herd immunity will likely not be reached due to the mindset evident in our societies. So I guess it's about the idea, are they stressing personal responsibility enough to take responsibility, I think, for the pandemic, for the environment, that intersection? Yes, Mark.
I would somewhat challenge the premise here that part of what we're seeing is that the outbreaks are occurring among segments of the population for whom, in some ways, personal responsibility isn't an option. You know, the nature of their economic circumstance, their work arrangements are such that they're put into places of risk, very high risk, as we're seeing. And it's at least as much, and have no choice in terms of needing to work and to feed their families and to house their families. So I think there's also been a catastrophic failure on the part of government to do the things the state is supposed to do in these circumstances, which is precisely to protect vulnerable populations. I mean, the province can't get its act together on the simple element of paid sick leave. Which, as I mentioned earlier, the folks in the infectious disease and epidemiological community have been screaming about. We seem to be unable to maintain, or even we were very slow to move to enforce basic occupational health and safety, or indeed enhanced occupational health and safety requirements in very, very vulnerable workplaces where people are having to work in close quarters. And again, for whom working from home is not an option. They are the doers. They have to do these things. So I'm you know, there's an element of personal responsibility, but I think we need to be very conscious of the extent to which many of the people who are now seeing, you know, in very vulnerable and are really taking the brunt of the third wave, have been in situations where they did what they could. They're very aware of the risks of the places they're in, but from a viewpoint of the need to work, have had no choice and have not been provided the appropriate supports and protections.
I could just echo a bit of what you're saying there, Mark, and to reiterate about what Eric was pointing out too, we have to remember that government has made things like mining an essential service. So we have miners flying into these communities that are trying to set up barriers to protect themselves from the miners coming into their territories. So at the same time, their own members aren't able to leave, like remote mining communities like in the Yukon or Nunavut, and being told to stay at home. They're having Southerners fly into their regions, and there have been cases in the oil sands in Alberta of cross-infection from the mining camps to the community. So despite these communities trying to take personal responsibility, they're still being put at risk by what government's overriding them and deciding is an essential service. And Eric was mentioning even about, you know, in California, the convicts and the COVID, and then trying to fight fires. So another example of some of the realities of trying to deal with these crises.
I was really struck in some of the interviews that we've been doing lately to hear the perspectives of real people on the ground about this. And I remember one in particular where we had someone who was taking the pandemic very seriously and then was forced back to work. as someone working in a food service establishment to serve people on patios. And her demeanor changed entirely in the subsequent interview, where she was saying, look, it's just a foregone conclusion now that I'm going to get COVID. I can't do anything about it with the ways I've been told I have to expose myself. And so for her, the risk perception came from the situation that she was being forced into, rather than vice versa. She wasn't in a place where she could give up that job during an economic downturn to be able to take on a less risky role. Her exposure was dictated by her boss's comfort level. And so I would join with the previous two commenters in saying, actually, I think that we've been much too focused on personal responsibility in this and not paid enough attention to the other aspects. When I sit on advisory panels for COVID, what I'm often trying to do is to get folks thinking about the opportunity and the capacity parts of the equation. Right? Do people actually have a choice they can make here? Or do we need to give them a chance to make that choice? So we heard regularly from folks who wanted to get tested and there were no test centers open near them, or they didn't have a vehicle and couldn't drive to them, or the hours didn't align with when they were working, who wanted to self-isolate, but are the sole caregiver for someone with a disability and don't have any other way of caring for them, if not them doing it. And so those capacity and opportunity points, I think, are so critical. And it suffice to say that I don't think we've seen on climate change, on wildfire, or again on COVID, that there's any indication we can police ourselves out of the crisis through individual responsibility when we're not dealing with the systematic features of the landscape in terms of who has capability, capacity, and opportunity.
And just to follow up on that, one of the things none of us have really addressed in our conversations is the gendered dimensions of this crisis on women and in the communities across Canada. The She session that's happening, women having to make these very important choices. We're caring for our children, we're trying to maintain our jobs, we're trying to do all we can, but just pointing that out, I think that there's a very real gender component to this that is something none of us have really had a chance to discuss.
I do think, just to add one last brief comment here, this does put an interesting color on our conversations about climate change, right? Because a lot of our discourse around climate change falls victim to the same sins as what we're doing with COVID, right? We wag the finger at someone and say, don't you hug your grandparent, right? It's your fault, without dealing with the fact that they have to take public transit to work, live in a congregate setting, have a close workplace, don't have paid sick days, et cetera, et cetera. And often when we talk about climate change fixes, we say, oh, shower less, turn your lights off, drive a little less, right? We've got to be careful about replicating those same challenges of individual tinkering around the margins when we've got some really big systematic issues that we have to address. And that's not to say we shouldn't play our role. That is absolutely virtuous for us to do. But let's not confuse the virtue of doing our part with a moral obligation to address systematic issues.
We need, in the design of our policies to deal with those systemic issues, we need to be very conscious of potential impacts on marginalized communities, which those who are formulating these policies have a tendency to overlook or to deal with as an afterthought, as opposed to thinking about this as at the front end of the conversation.
Thank you. I was very struck last night listening to Dr. Callie Barrett. I don't know if you saw that interview circulating, just about the intersection with poverty, that poverty, compassion. I think, again, it gets back to our first talk about love. And if we had more love in our policy about how we think about how different people interact with the pandemic, with their environments that they have so little control over, to move forward, and why the ICUs are filled with people who are essential workers. They are not the white collar who are vaccinated and working from home. They're the Amazon, the people working in Amazon delivery facilities, the people who are delivering our food, working in our grocery stations. And then again, as has been said, so this idea of policy and the quietest voices, the ones that are not being heard, are the ones who are being impacted the most. So it is definitely beyond personal, of course, as everybody said, going on to personal policy, personal responsibility, but definitely needing policies to manage that. So going from the micro of the individual, going to a larger question, this is a question from Suraj Paul Jagwalmahan. To deal with vulnerability of global supply chains, what contribution is academia at York University making to Made in Canada vaccine long-term solutions? It's a tough one. I don't know if we, that's the question, global supply chains, even broadly in thinking about that, or if any. Yeah, please.
It's such a great topic, and there should be a whole panel on that, because lots of my colleagues in the School of Administrative Studies are working explicitly on supply chains. We've got folks working on vaccine topics. I do think this is an interesting question, again, because I think there is certainly some clear evidence that having some of this capacity internally is a critical and important thing. But I do think that it's really important for us to remember what I think is the key lesson from COVID-19, which is that global health is a team sport. And I think one of the things that I have found a little bit distressing and unfortunate through the crisis is the way that there's been some retrenchment into provincialism and a little bit of putting up walls in the wake of this crisis. And we can look through all phases of the disaster in terms of the need for good multilateral institutions and global cooperation. To detect pandemics in the first place, we need a system where people can be open and honest and transparent and are encouraged to do so. To manufacture vaccines in one country requires supplies from lots of other countries. It requires expertise from lots of other countries. The strategy that we've seen played in terms of vaccine procurement, and part of what has benefited us in having such access to Moderna and Pfizer vaccines has been the fact that if you're wagering only on your homegrown suppliers, you risk being locked in on perhaps not as good a solution or a slower rollout of a solution too. And so I think one of the things that's been striking to me here is that it can be tempting to solve these kinds of problems by saying, let's make it so that we are stronger and able to do this. But I think often we need to remember that there's a collective we on a global scale that we need to strengthen and work together here too. And I think that also has many analogs into the fight against climate change and deforestation and species preservation too. Those are not issues that we can fix by doing really well within our borders alone.
Please, James.
Yeah, one thing I was just thinking about, as the last speaker was just talking, was not necessarily about vaccines, but about efforts to kind of avoid pandemics like this moving forward. And several of the speakers on this panel have mentioned that it's a human encroachment into the natural environment that has created conditions where pandemics like COVID are encountered and then spread around the world. And supply chains are obviously a huge part of that in allowing viruses to spread quite rapidly. And I was thinking about that in relation to what I've been talking about in terms of parks and conservation areas. And I think moving forward, I've been talking about people visiting parks and conservation areas, but I think in terms of pandemics and avoiding future pandemics, we also need to think about a role for protected areas and conservation areas in key areas to prevent human encroachment into certain places as a potential way to avoid pandemics moving forward as well. I think we can think about not just the role of vaccines in managing pandemics like this, but a role for conservation measures to prevent pandemics from happening in the first place.
Just add, yeah, I appreciate the comments. I guess I think also about global health as also being planetary health, and that has to happen at all kinds of scales, like just being very isolated in those kind of borders, that doesn't help that situation, because that's not how water works. That's not how migratory birds operate. Like the world, like it doesn't work that way in the real world, the natural world. And I guess I just also wanted to just convey that to some extent, just based on what everyone has said, and I appreciate everyone's comments and their expertise. I learned a lot as well. is that I always hear this narrative of, we can't wait to go back to normal. I'm like, but normal wasn't good. Normal is kind of what caused this whole situation in the first place. So to me, it sounds like almost terrible to say that the situation we're dealing with also provides an opportunity to rethink, how do we want to be? How do we want to be? What is the world we want to look like? All these reports, all this work that all of us are engaged in calls for transformation. Now's the time so that we don't have to do this all again, like start tackling those root problems of which climate crisis and climate change was identified, this, humans' unhealthy interactions with the natural world. So I think going back to normal isn't going to be, that's not going to solve this at all. So it's, so I don't know what it's going to look like, but I hope we kind of have some imagination in all of this and look to responsibility at different levels, globally, nationally, and otherwise.
Mark, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting conversation because there's sort of a whole bunch of potential trade-offs here. And as Deb's saying, I mean, normal turned out to be quite fragile. And so that may not be where we want to get back to. I mean, we're in this on the larger globalization question. I mean, in theory, yes, sort of more network systems should be more resilient. But what we ended up with was something seemingly much more fragile, and it also opened up new vulnerabilities in the sense we created networks under which vectors could travel very, very easily. So if we're going to think about these things going forward, is how do you get the resiliency that goes from the network sort of component, but also mitigate the fragilities that we seem to have maneuvered ourselves into by putting perhaps too much emphasis on efficiency in a very narrow sense over everything else.
Thank you. The next question comes in for Gabrielle, and it's about the part in your talk where you're talking about legislation being put through while the province was, or the country was really preoccupied with COVID-19. So what can we do as citizens to support the protection of our northern communities, i.e. fighting that bill that was slid in while we were busy with COVID-19, that's putting pressure on supporting food supplies for remote communities, etc. It's like watching another atrocity to our Indigenous communities over and over again. Embarrassing.
I just wrote a whole chapter for a book on this because it is really astounding that they could push legislation through in a matter of weeks. Last year, it was second reading and royal assent within one day, and July 21st, I believe. And it was an omnibus piece of legislation. So it altered a number of Ontario pieces of legislation. But what was really alarming is sort of the rollback of environmental assessment to basically the whim of the minister in charge deciding when it could be triggered. And therefore, we know, one of his campaign promises that the premier had was, I will get on the bulldozer if I have to in order to access the Ring of Fire territory. And they call it bulldozer legislation now up in the north. Because as I pointed out, most of these communities have been, Chief Alvin Fiddler of the Anishinaabe Oski Nation has been going to communities. We saw one of our MPs getting inoculated in the communities. The focus on COVID has been paramount. But at the same time, I got a phone call from the chief last summer saying, wait a second, a new gold mine just opened in our territory. The premier was there, the prime minister was there. They all flew in during COVID travel restriction period in order to open this mine that nobody knew about. It wasn't advertised nationally. There was a small article in the Thunder Bay newspaper about I'm Gold opening. And so all of this is sort of going under the cloak of COVID. So I think there's two components to this. I mean, going back to the personal responsibility, it is up to us as Southerners to be aware of what is going on. And that, as I just said in a recent podcast, that means taking a moment away from Instagram and social media, which is hard. We're being bombarded with numbers of COVID every day and press releases, but to really step aside and really listen to and look for the information about what is going on. And to be fair, like I said, the Grand Chief himself hadn't been made aware that this mine was happening. it was a bit of a surprise. I mean, the communities impacted were involved and were aware, but this wasn't something commonly known. So there is a struggle to get information. But I would urge us as Canadians and Ontario citizens to be mindful and aware of what the legislation. I mean, I know it's not something, as a political scientist, I'm a bit of a nerd, so that's something that I kind of pay attention to. But I mean, there are, it is possible to find out what's going on and to make ourselves aware. And I guess the end of the day, it's to write your local MP and to make sure you're informed and to point out that, it's up to us to start challenging. I mean, as far as I know, the only groups challenging this legislation are Nature Canada and some of the environmental organizations who are coming out, speaking out against this environmental legislation. I don't know if any of the other panelists want to pick up on this, but yeah, I would encourage us, at sort of a Noam Chomsky perspective of we all have a responsibility to make ourselves aware of what's going on. But I mean, to be fair, it was lightning speed passed. It was under the radar of most people. It was part of an omnibus legislation, so it was something easy for a lot of people to miss.
Yeah, although I mean, the Ford government and the Alberta government have been particularly notable about this, and EA was just one piece of a tidal wave that moved through, and with the Ford government, particularly in Ontario, I mean, that direction was set before the pandemic. What happened was an acceleration, and it's a increasingly borderline sort of authoritarian, arbitrary, capricious approach to governance, because one of the themes has been to get rid of rules-based approaches, essentially what's been going on in land use planning, for example, and essentially make it by ministerial whim, for lack of a better way to put it. I mean, that's fundamentally what the ministerial zoning order issue is about in the land use planning regime. It's about whatever that you want something, you just ask the minister. It's a governance style that sort of belongs in the 50s, or Duplessis type stuff, or Mitch Hepburn. And I think that's a larger set of questions that's sort of underlying this in terms of how certain governments have approached their roles and their approaches to decision making. And you can make a link back to the way COVID's been handled, because again, it's been a lot of doing end runs around what were supposed to be the decision-making structures and frameworks. I mean, the auditor talked about this in terms of what happened with emergency measures in Public Health Ontario and the management of the COVID outbreak. Well, we didn't follow the rules that were supposed to be there to manage these sorts of situations. And so you end up with this sort of make it up as you go along approach to decision making. And what was been done to EA and what's been done on land use planning and a bunch of other areas are totally consistent with that kind of an approach to governance.
Thank you. There was just a question from Danielle Hayashi. We're over time, but it was just a quick clarification. What was the bill number? So that if people did want to write, do people know the bill number?
197.
197.
Yeah, the COVID economic recovery bill.
Thank you. Well, the time, as always, has zipped away. We're over time again at 12:01, and I apologize to all of those questions that have come through that I have not. I told the panelists when they came in, trust me, there'll be lots of questions. And again, we were not able to get to all the questions that have flooded through. Thank you, everybody, for posing your insightful questions and engaging with our panelists. I also want to thank our speakers for taking time out of their Saturday to come and speak to us about the intersection of the pandemic and the environment in our final speaker series. It's been an honor to host all of you this morning and to listen and learn alongside your experts. Best part of my jobs are these York Circles. I love being able to hear from our speakers. So I'll now turn it over to Julie Lafford for a few final housekeeping items before we say goodbye. Thank you, everybody.
I want to thank the panelists as well. Drs. Kennedy, McGregor, Slowey, Stinson, Winfield. Your lectures were really thought-provoking and also somewhat emotional for me. And I really particularly loved the discussion at the end and how you built on each other's ideas. So thank you so much for sharing your time and your work with us today. And of course, I want to thank Dr. Pillai Riddell for leading us through such an engaging discussion today and speaker series this year. I want to thank you also for your commitment to public education. You've put together a really thoughtful York Circle series this past academic year, and it's been a true pleasure to work with you. So thank you, Rebecca. I also want to thank the audience for taking the time to join us and participate in the Q&A session. Before we draw the names for the prizes, I have one last poll for you. And this question helps us keep our events moving forward. How would you rate your knowledge of the topic of today's presentation following this great discussion? So please take a moment to reply before you leave. And it's now time to announce the lucky winners of our $25 gift cards, courtesy of our affinity partner, MBNA. Congratulations to Joan Moore, Craig McIntosh, Anja Elong, Steve Lim, and our team will be in contact with you after the event to fulfill your prize. Thanks again to everybody who attended. This is the final session of this series, but we'll be back in September for the new academic year. And we're asking you for help on what topics you want us to address. So in a few weeks' time, you'll receive an email from us asking for your suggestions and ideas. Please take a moment to respond to that too. In the meantime, you can join our other virtual events and webinars throughout the spring and summer, including the York U of the Future event on April 30th at noon. This will be in conversation with President Rhonda Linton, and it should prove to be a really excellent event as well. And you can learn more about all of our events at yorku.ca/alumni and friends. That link should appear in the chat now. And finally, as always, we're always interested in hearing from you. If you have any suggestions or feedback about this or any of the other events or programs we do, follow us on social media, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Instagram. You can search York University Alumni. And as a reminder, today's presentation will be posted on our York U Alumni YouTube channel, and we encourage you to share that with your friends or anyone else who might be interested. Thanks for being with us again for York Circle at Home. I wish especially those in Ontario under our new restrictions the best in your health, both mental and physical, and everywhere. I hope all of our alumni and friends take care of yourselves and each other.